Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures Podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks, and today I've got a really exciting interview for you. We are going back to Nepal to do the Annapurna Circuit, and not everything goes as planned. And that's one of the cool things we're going to learn during today's interview, is that sometimes with adventure travel, things don't go as planned, but that's okay. And sometimes we have type 2 fun, which if you're not familiar with that phrase, means it's only fun looking in the rearview mirror and not necessarily at the time you're doing it. It's a real fun interview that brought back lots of fond memories of my own trip to Himalayas, and I can't wait to share it with you. So let's get started. Namaste. Today we have with us author Tracy Pawelski to talk with us about her Annapurna trek and her new book about her adventure called One Woman's Walk in the Himalayas. If you don't mind, Tracy, I think it kind of helps us to feel that it's doable for all of us if we train. If you wouldn't mind sharing your age and a little bit about who you are as an adventurer.
Sure. Well, hello, Kit. I am so delighted to be on this podcast, and I get so many good ideas from listening to Active Travel Adventures. So I'm happy to share some of my adventures as well. I am 57 years old. I live in central Pennsylvania, not far from the Appalachian Trail. I have been a traveler all of my life, but came fairly recently to adventure travel. About 5 years ago, I left a highly visible corporate job, and I left it by way of walking El Camino de Santiago with then my 21-year-old daughter, Juliet. And what it offered to me was an opportunity for reflection and reinvention that a long distance journey like El Camino gives you. And so I was looking for my next step, where I wanted to make my contribution when I returned. And this walk with Juliet really gave me an opportunity to think deeply about those things. So that was my real first step, if you will, into endurance walking, trekking, and that form of adventure travel.
And since I had the benefit of reading your new book, it was Juliet's idea to walk, and you kind of tagged along. Did I understand that correctly?
That's correct. When we walked El Camino de Santiago, Juliet was just graduating from Gettysburg College, and she had decided that without any real concrete job plans, that's what she was going to do for the summer. And so here I am looking for my next step. And so I asked permission. I said, can I come along? And kudos to Juliet for saying yes. Somewhat remarkable. I'm not sure how many 21-year-olds really want to walk 500 miles across Spain with their mom, but Juliet graciously said yes, and so that gave me my next step.
And a wonderful bonding experience too with your daughter, I'm sure. Did you have any hesitation, being at the modest age of in your early 50s, to say, you've not done anything like that before? What gave you the confidence to think you could walk 500 miles?
Well, that's a good question. I wasn't sure how things would turn out. As we all think about these sort of new adventures, we wonder and sometimes we worry. I certainly trained as best I could to get into good shape. But there were lots of things about this walk across Spain, and 500 miles, if you think about it, that's a long way. I wasn't sure what to expect, whether or not I would be strong enough physically. I wasn't sure if this adventure with my daughter would draw us closer together or drive a wedge between us. How would that work out? It was an interesting time in both of our lives. Juliet moving from sort of not childhood, but very young adulthood to young womanhood, and me in a state of transition as well.
And then, as it does with most of us, at least everybody that listens to this show, once you get that adventure travel bug, it bites you pretty hard. And then, so what happened post that trip? What other things have you done with this new confidence and this new desire to explore the world?
That's such a great question, because it really does get into your DNA. When I got back from El Camino de Santiago, I felt like I was still searching in some ways. You know, you don't figure everything out in 35 days, which is the time it took Juliet and I to walk across Spain. So as a seeker, I had this crazy idea to keep going. And on El Camino de Santiago, we had sort of a Camino family that forms for many people who walk the way. And one of the members of my Camino family from Ireland was putting together a small expedition to walk the Annapurna Circuit in Nepal. And my friend Chuck gave me the opportunity to join that small expedition. And so as I thought about it, I thought, well, what a wonderful opportunity, one I might not be offered again, to go to a part of the world I had not been. When I talked to my husband about it and we discussed it, he said, I think you should go to Nepal. And so I had his encouragement, which I always have. And so I set out to train and to prepare for a very different kind of walk, a high altitude walk in the Himalayas.
We covered the Annapurna Circuit back in episode 28 of the Active Travel Adventures podcast, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But that was a guided trip with Active Adventures. Here you are going with a gentleman you meet on the El Camino who arranges his own expedition. And we're going to get in a little bit later some of the complications that came because of that. But before we get there, could you please explain to us the different types of treks that you can do in Annapurna? Because there is some confusion, and we want to just kind of clarify that.
Sure. The ones that I know about, and the one that I was on, is the Annapurna Circuit, which it's about 130 miles in total around the Annapurna Massif. But there are other treks there as well. One is to the Annapurna Sanctuary. That happened to be the trek that my friend Chuck had taken several years ago. And so he was putting together this small expedition to go back to a part of the world where he had been. There are other shorter treks as well. Another trek in that region called the Annapurna Base Camp. So you've heard of, or many people have heard of, Everest Base Camp. So that takes you to where people are stopping before they go much higher up and climbing the Annapurnas.
Great. And then also I wanted to mention the Mustang region, which is even more remote than the area that you went to, that Active Adventures also goes to, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So to confirm, which Annapurna trek did you do?
So Chuck and I started out on the Annapurna Circuit.
This is the approximately 130 miles that you were doing. And so let's dial back a little bit. And so Chuck had made the arrangements, and then you fly in and you get there and you run into a little bit of a complication with the guide situation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, Chuck did make the arrangements. He had been there before. And the first thing that happened that was sort of interesting and a little twist in the plot was that there were to be 4 of us on this trek, and the 2 others from Ireland backed out. The man had fallen, I think, and broken a rib, and so he wasn't in good enough shape to do this fairly rigorous trek. So Chuck and I talked about it, and I basically said, if you're in, I'm in. So we do meet in Kathmandu, and the plan is to then make our way to Pokhara, which is a very beautiful destination. It's a town where many trekkers begin it's kind of a jumping off point for many of these excursions in the Annapurnas. It's also a yoga retreat, and so you have a lot of people who travel to Pokhara for those reasons. So we were to trek the Annapurna Circuit with a man named Bimson, who had been Chuck's trusted guide when he was in the region in the past. And when we got there, we met with Bimson. He arrived with 2 other men. He had walked 2 hours. The 3 men had walked 2 hours to meet with us at our hotel out of their village in the mountains. And Bimson basically said, I'm old. My knees are not good. I cannot take you into the mountains. Meet Ganesh, my nephew. And on that, he turned around and he walked back to his village. And so that was a big surprise. We thought we knew who we were going up into the mountains with. And all of a sudden, there was a new guide and a new porter named Moti. So we sat down and tried to sort of process, okay, we have to build a relationship with someone different than who we thought it was going to be. And Ganesh was clearly a very sort of accomplished guide. So we spent about 4 hours that afternoon talking about our permits, talking about the route and when we would get started the next morning and what to expect. So that was the first little twist in the program.
Did you feel comfortable at the end of that 4-hour period that you were with somebody that, because going to the mountains at any time can be a risk. And these particularly high mountains, you've got the elevation issues to deal with as well. So talk a little bit about what that felt like and your confidence in going with basically was a complete stranger 4 hours prior up into these Himalayas.
It's such a good question. And it's true. You really need to have the confidence and the trust when you embark on a trip of this nature. So I am quickly sort of thinking through and processing the fact that this is not who I thought I was going up into the mountains with. But Ganesh was clearly a very skilled guide. And so over the course of those 4 hours, you sort of settle down, you ask professional questions, and you build that relationship. So yes, by the end of the 4 hours, I think we were fully prepared to go up into the mountains with Ganesh. Now, I will tell you, as part of that conversation, though, we asked him, and we had not known exactly what to expect in terms of the price. The year that we did the Annapurna Circuit, it was 2015, and there had been a devastating earthquake, if you'll recall, in Nepal that April. And it had left a lot of devastation and a lot of issues with the price of things, the conditions we would find, an already fragile and somewhat primitive infrastructure. So at the end of this conversation, after we're talking about the route and the permits, Ganesh gets to the price. And when he quotes us the price of $150 a day, it is about 5 times more than what we expected. So we're also processing, okay, this is a new guide, and oh my gosh, this is a way different price than we expected. And so we had to make a decision that, well, we came all this way, and we're not going to let the price get in our way from doing what we said we wanted to do.
And there's a great story about that. You go into detail about that in the book. So I'll let people wait to get more of the details of that when they do read the book. But let's go also talk about just the difficulty for it. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most difficult, where would you place this?
I would place the trek as a 4. And the altitude certainly is part of the rigor. The high pass is at about 18,000 feet. And so that is pretty high. That can put you, and I made a decision as we get further along in the story to actually turn around before that high pass. And my stopping point was a town called Manang. So this is not a trek that you can't do, but there are weather conditions that can be quite tricky. You have to think about the time of year that you're traveling. And you certainly have to take some precautions when it comes to water, when it comes to personal safety, certainly is not getting lost and making sure that you stay on the route and things like that. Finally, one of the things that you need to do, of course, is to train and to make sure that your body is ready for a high altitude walk.
And how did you do that?
Well, that's a good question. I felt like I was in the best shape of my life after walking 500 miles across Spain. But I didn't take lightly the fact that I was training for something very different. And so I put a pack on my back and went out on the Appalachian Trail with my husband and with friends. I tried to do interval training because I was trying to prepare for the altitude. And I'm not really a runner, so that kind of training left me feeling a little bit inadequate and not knowing what to expect. I've always been very careful about what I put in my pack and traveling really as light as I possibly can. But when you're going to a place where you're walking from the lowlands, if you will, at about maybe, 3,000 feet where we began, and you're, wearing fast wicking t-shirts and things like that. And then you're walking up onto snowpack where you need a down jacket. You need to have a few things in your pack to be prepared for the change in weather conditions.
And at that altitude, you can have snow any time of year. So you went in October, which you believe to be the best time of year, or tell us a little bit about the best time windows.
Absolutely. So they say that there are two really good windows to walk in the Himalayas: the May timeframe and the October timeframe. And October is great because it tends to be the very beginning of the dry season. So you have monsoon weather, and then you have a dry season that ensues. It's before any snow hits, and it gets really cold up in the mountains. And so you have this window, if you will, that in the spring and the fall. And the climbers, by the way, look carefully at those weather windows as well. And I wasn't climbing, but there are certain time frames that are better than others for those sorts of treks.
So you are staying in tea houses. What are you packing things, or is Ganesh packing things for you, or what do you have to bring yourself, or what kind of weight's on your back?
We were traveling with a guide and a porter. And the porter typically carries the heavier packs, and you carry a day pack. So you've got a guide to lead the way, and then you've got a porter who is carrying heavier loads.
And so what's in the heavier load if you're staying in a tea house?
The things that I had in my larger pack included an extra set of shoes. I was wearing hiking boots, but I had a backup on shoes. I had my down jacket for when I might have needed it, and and some changes of clothes and things like that. So it wasn't a terribly heavy pack, even though that was the heavier one, but it was certainly more than what you would carry with a day pack, particularly when you're carrying water with you in your day pack or on a camel on your back.
And is access to water, whether it's clean or not clean, is there plenty of water?
That's a good question, Kit. I was really worried. Part of my research was making sure I understood if clean water would be available along the way. And in many cases, you can purchase water. It gets more expensive the higher up in the Himalayas that you walk, but it's typically available in these small villages. There are a few places where you can get water from certain community wells that they say are safe for drinking. I wasn't comfortable with that because I didn't quite know how safe they were, unlike in Spain where there's potable water along the way. And so I was very careful. I also had a SteriPen with me, which, if you're familiar with that, is a way to sterilize water and make sure that if you do get water that has anything in it, that you're zapping any bacteria that might have come along with you.
And so also the SteriPen is a great idea. I'm going to link to the Adventure Travel Show podcast where I talk about water purification. So you have all the different options out there. I prefer to bring a Sawyer squeeze. So that way, whenever I see a stream, I don't have to worry if it's got Giardia or whatever it is. I can drink as much water as I want without having to carry a couple gallons in the back. So I'll make sure to put links to that because that's important because you do not want to get sick. And particularly when you're on a trek like that, you don't want to be stopping every couple of minutes. So it's best to be safe. I think you're smart. If there's livestock, there could be E. coli, there could be Giardia, all sorts of stuff in the stream. Even if the locals are used to it, your body may not be used to it.
That's right.
Now, you also went during, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the Dashane holiday for the goddess of Durga. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's right. The Dashane holiday, this was something that I didn't fully appreciate until we arrived in country. It is a 2-week holiday amongst mostly the Hindus, where sort of like Christian Christmas, families get together, they go home and they visit. And what happened was, while we were there during that holiday, many of the guides who would normally have been available had gone back to their home villages and were celebrating with their families. And so it made it for a bit of scarcity in terms of the people that we saw who had come then down out of the mountains into bigger towns and things like that to celebrate with families in other villages. So it was very interesting. There weren't as many services available as a result of that holiday.
Did you see any special decor or food or activities because of the holiday?
We did, especially when we were in the lower reaches. So you walk from sort of the Hindu lowlands up to the higher Himalayas, where it's predominantly Buddhist. And lower down, there were people who were traveling down, families with things on their backs, many of them herding goats. I remember one day there were 3 men who were struggling with a buffalo. And what happens is this holiday has an element of animal sacrifice as part of it, at least as part of the ritualism. And so some of these goats were destined for dinner, and some of them, like the buffalo, were destined to be part of that celebration as well. So yes, we did see some preparations for Dashane. We also saw the construction in some villages of something called a ping. And that's where one day we walked through a village where about 10 men and boys were working with these very long bamboo shoots, and they were constructing a giant swing. And if you can think of these bamboo shoots all tethered at the top with a swing hanging down in the middle, like a big spider, a big daddy long legs with a swing hanging down, and tether it at the top so that the swing could hang down. And it was, from what our guide talked to us about, it was fun for the entire community, certainly, especially for the kids, these makeshift swings or pings.
So we're talking about festivals and all that. I'm sure there's food. Let's talk a little bit about the food that you ate.
Most of what we ate up in the mountains and across Nepal was called dal bhat, which is a mix of lentils and some vegetables, and lentils being not the only protein, but probably the most predominant protein. It was interesting when we would sit down, my guide and porter would eat with their hands and mix together some of these different, whether there was potatoes or garlic or sometimes a pickled item there with the lentils. There were always utensils available for me as a Western woman, but dal bhat was certainly the mainstay of our diets.
If somebody is a meat eater, I know that they had for the festival, is meat readily available if somebody wanted that extra protein?
You know, I said earlier that we were there not only during festival time, but in the year that followed in the same year as the earthquake. And so there appeared to be a fair amount of scarcity of a lot of things. I did not see a lot of meat. There were more options, certainly in Kathmandu and lower down. But as we got higher up, dal bhat was the main item on the menu. And then as you got higher up, there were some selections of yak. So you begin to get into the higher reaches and toward the town of Manang. And I started to see things like yak burgers in one of the places and different selections with yak.
And one of the main reasons people go to the Himalayas is for the beauty. Can you talk a little bit about the landscape and what you saw?
Oh, the beauty is truly awe-inspiring. You know, they say it is a place to feel both big and small at the same time. And walking is such a wonderful way to experience a landscape as well as a culture. So walking lower down was through rice terraces. And as we climbed past waterfalls, then you begin to get onto more rockier, scrubbier ground as you get a little bit higher in altitude. And it's very interesting how the landscape changes. And then, of course, you get up and you begin to see the white peaks of the Annapurnas and a number of the other highest peaks in the world. And so as the landscape transforms, it kind of brings you along with it. It's a quite remarkable journey and awe-inspiring, as they say. You can understand why the Hindus and the Buddhas believe that these mountains are holy.
Definitely. And I know landscape photos don't do justice to what you actually see, and the photos are striking.
They are indeed. And one of the other things on this journey is we followed a big river called the Marasangi. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And it was very interesting because, and we crossed a lot of suspension bridges, by the way, which were a lot of fun. Sometimes they were made of wood. Other times they were made of metal slats. But sometimes they would be low over the river as it went by, and other times they got higher and higher when we were walking through gorges and higher up. So it was very interesting to experience this river as it got bigger and smaller. Further away and down in the valley, sometimes it would look just like a ribbon of blue strewn on the valley floor.
And these suspension bridges, are they well constructed that you felt safe on them?
Some of the suspension bridges lower down were made of wood, and there may have been a few slats here and there that could have been replaced. But most of these bridges were well constructed. I never felt unsafe on any of them.
Would somebody with a fear of heights have a problem on some of those bridges?
Some of those bridges got pretty high up, so I'm sure they would hold on their way across.
How about telling us, what's a typical day? Describe what we might expect on an average day doing this trek.
Each day was a bit different, with the exception of the element of walking, and we were walking up. So I talked a little bit about how the landscape changed, but the rhythm of the day would start out with breakfast at the tea house. Sometimes it was some muesli and black coffee. You would usually place your order the night before. And then we would get started and start walking. And as you get higher up, of course, you're moving more slowly, and the altitude has an impact. So stopping for breaks, certainly stopping for photos and looking at these, really incredible, remarkable mountains, these vistas that look down into big drops and gorges. There are waterfalls along the way lower down. So you don't want to miss that by being either just looking at your feet and each footfall that you make or not stopping to appreciate the beauty around you. Usually then a lunch place where you could stop. Masala chai tea is something that we had on a regular basis, and we would stop somewhere. Again, these villages are between, I would say, at least every 2 hours of walking, we would come to a village. It sometimes depended. And of course, our guide was leading the way. And so we would stop whenever he sort of had the plan in his plans to stop and have lunch or take a break. And then typically we would get to our destination by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That was a longer day in some cases than what I experienced on El Camino de Santiago, where I also, because I wasn't with a guide, had a little bit more discretion and independence on when I wanted to stop. If I sort of was tired that day, I didn't have that same opportunity here, but that worked out okay. And we were certainly on a bit of, the guide knew the better places to stop and how far in between they were. When we would get to our final place for the evening, we would check into one of the guest houses and one of the tea houses, and usually place an order for dinner and go off and clean up. So on Camino, you typically wash your clothes out every single day and let them dry in the hot Spanish sun. Didn't really have that same opportunity in the Himalayas because things might not dry quite as quickly. And so I wasn't necessarily washing my clothes by hand every single day. And washing up it got colder and colder, by the way, with sometimes just a bucket of hot water as we got to the higher reaches. One place that was very interesting was called Upper Pisang. And there is a Gampa, or a Buddhist temple in Upper Pisang, where we were able to attend the services that the monks were holding. And so that was a very, very interesting place and a wonderful evening culturally.
Very fun. Did you get to meet many locals outside of the guides?
Not really. There were a lot of children along the way, and we were certainly able to translate, say hello, ask permission if we could take a photo. There were lots of smiles and waves. I didn't know if they weren't in school because of the festival or if they didn't always go to school. I wasn't quite sure, but there were lots of kids. And then there were some people along the way who were either running the tea houses, or we could stop and buy some provisions in some of the villages, but it was not that same connection to the community, if you will, as that you have in other places. And part of that, of course, is the language barrier.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel welcomed by body language?
The Nepalese have a guest culture in many ways. So there were lots of smiles, and I did always feel welcome. So yes, that was one of the things, a very sort of heartwarming culture and a warm welcome in the Himalayas.
So your adventure had lots of twists and turns, one of which is all of a sudden Chuck can't complete the trek with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and your decision points there?
Yes, so that was a big moment, if you will, a big decision that I had to make. My friend Chuck, and in full disclosure, I knew all of this ahead of time, had a heart attack many years earlier and had continued his mountaineering, had never had any problems subsequent to that. But he was wearing a heart monitor. And the day that we walked past the point where you can no longer get a Jeep, so you're now walking, or that's pretty much the only way to move forward, Chuck basically said, I'm not feeling poorly, but my heart monitor is reading 170 at resting. He said, this has been going on for the last day and a half. I think I need to turn back. And I fully supported that decision. We certainly didn't want to risk a medical emergency. We wanted to make sure that Chuck was safe and that he got down to a lower altitude. We weren't at a very high altitude at this point, so I think it was just the exertion. And by the way, Chuck was just fine, but he did make the decision to turn back. At that point in time, I had the decision to make too. And we had been walking for several days, and some of my worries that I had about whether or not I could do this, I kind of felt like I had the feel for things. And so with Chuck's full support, I made the decision to continue on with my guide and porter. I also made the decision that I didn't need to go across the high pass, which had been a big worry for me, and this disaster that had occurred, of course, the year before at the same time. And so I decided I would walk as high as Manang. Manang is a really interesting place. It's not only a place where trekkers stop to acclimate before they continue on across the high pass. They usually spend an extra day there to do so. But it's on the old trading route of the old Silk Road. So it's been this sort of at this crossroads for many, many years. And there are more services there as far as the town goes. And it's quite an interesting place. So there were more guest houses. There was actually a movie theater there. So I went to the movies. I can tell you a little bit more. There's an interesting story there as well. But my turning point turned out to be a place called Manang.
And what do you remember roughly what elevation that is?
Manang is just around 14,000 feet.
Yeah, that's still too high. I don't do well with elevation. Once I get over 12, I start having some issues. So I'd be going down with Chuck. Now, did Chuck go down back on by himself, or did he have a guide take him back down?
No, he got into a Jeep. So we turned around. We had walked just past that point that I mentioned where there was no longer road access, if you will. And so we got Chuck back down. We got a Jeep for him to return down to where we started, which was a town called Besisahar. So he took what was a 10-hour ride back down the mountain to Besisahar and then caught a bus back to Pokhara. And again, he was not in an urgent, life-threatening situation, or else I would have gone with him. But he made the decision, and it was, of course, the right decision not to risk a problem higher up.
That makes perfectly good sense on both parts. So now you're on your own with two folks that I imagine speak broken English at best. So does it get a little lonely out there, or what are you thinking these last few days?
It's such a good question about how it feels to be on your own, even if you have a guide and a porter with you. And by the way, my guide was a very wonderful man and an English speaker, a very capable English speaker. My porter was younger. His English was not quite so good. He had always had a big smile on his face, but the kinds of conversations that you have when you're walking with a partner or a friend are much different than when you're walking with a guide and a porter, which tends to be a little more fact-based. So certainly there were conversations about what I was seeing, the nature that was around us, the name of the mountains, what was growing in the fields. And my guide was very, very good at that sort of thing. In fact, I said, you should have been a biologist. He was quite knowledgeable. But as far as the experience you're having that you want to share with someone else in a communal way, this was not that experience. And that was in fairly striking contrast to the experience that you have on a walk like El Camino de Santiago, which is a very communal kind of walk. You meet people from all over the world and strike up conversations. It's part of the magic of El Camino. Here in the mountains, and again, because of the earthquake, many trekkers had canceled their plans. And so there weren't many people on the Annapurna Circuit at all. There were a few people along the way, and I did meet a wonderful, intrepid Dutch couple, Bob and Ellie. We spent 2 days together, and we didn't meet until we were just about a day out of Manang. So I didn't get to spend much time with them, but I was so delighted to have someone to talk to and to laugh with and to share a meal.
Yes, that was a fun part of the book, too. And another thing I like, too, is the hanging of the prayer flags, which remind me of my trip to Bhutan. And I just love the prayer flags. Why don't you tell us the story behind that?
Chuck and I had bought prayer flags when we were down in Kathmandu. And they had actually been blessed by a monk who threw holy water and rice on them and then gave them back to us. And our plan was to hang them at Tharang La, which was the high pass. Many people do that. So when Chuck turned back, he gave the prayer flags to me. And since I wasn't going to cross the high pass, when we got to Manang, we found a place right by what's called the Gangapurna ice fall. And there are prayer flags there as well. It's quite beautiful. It's quite stark. There's a glacier sort of sliding down from a mountain called Gangapurna. And that glacier slides right into a cobalt blue lake. And so we decided that that was the perfect place to hang our flags. And so I took one end and of these string of Buddhist prayer flags, and my guide took the other, and we strung them there. You could tell which ones were ours flapping in the wind because all of the others were faded by the light, but not ours, not yet.
I love how the prayer flags, as they're going in the breeze, they're sending out blessings to all sentient beings around the world. I just love those. It was one of my favorite things about the Bhutanese culture.
It is wonderful. And to experience a culture that's very, very different from your own, that stuck with me, as well as the prayer wheels, that when we got to a certain altitude where the villages were now predominantly Buddhist, there were prayer wheels in walls in the middle of each of the villages. And I would pass on the left, and you would run your hand along these prayer wheels on the right. That was the tradition for those blessings as well. And people, believers, would leave small stones and tokens and sometimes bits of cloth along the way, which reminded me too of the Cruz de Ferro for some of your listeners who are familiar with El Camino de Santiago, where you leave a memento behind.
So put a link to the El Camino episode as well in the show notes. So on the day before you finally make it to Manang, you visit the Braga Monastery. Braga? Did I say that right?
Yes, Braga.
Tell us about that.
Well, that monastery is said to be the oldest in the Himalayas, and it hangs off the side of a mountain that overlooks the Marasangi River and this very dry plateau that we've now walked onto. It's really quite something. David Whyte, the English poet, has been there and written some wonderful poems about Braga. You climb up the steps, and in order to enter into the monastery, the door was locked when we got there, but there was a sign, and there were a young Italian couple who wanted to visit the monastery as well. And they seemed to know the drill, and they went looking for the caretaker. And so this somewhat ancient stooped man comes and for 100 Nepalese rupees lets us into this monastery and into the rooms that I guess are available to the public. It was just a couple of rooms that we had access to, but it was quite dark. There were faces everywhere where there were Buddhas that were lined up 3 deep, sitting Buddhas. There were altars that were filled with small offerings of apples and marigolds and incense. There were pictures of the Dalai Lama and sometimes fierce-looking masks that were on columns between these altars. And so it was a very, very special place and a moving place. When I left the monastery, you could go and stand on the roof of one of the buildings and overlook then this beautiful scene as you're higher now in the Himalayas with the Annapurnas and Gangapurna, and then the Marasangi River again down below you. There were even wild horses that were grazing along the river.
How beautiful. And you could also see your endpoint there too in Manang. What did it feel like seeing the end of your journey, and what was it like when you finally got there?
So my turning around point again was Manang. And one of the things that I knew I wanted to do when I got there was take a little pony ride. One of the things I love to do when I travel is see the world from the back of a horse. And so the emotions that go through you as you reach a destination that has been hard fought are, I think, a combination of personal satisfaction and accomplishment as well as relief. And so I was excited to reach that point. I was thinking, I'm going to take my pony ride, which is what I said I was going to do when I reached this turnaround point. And then I will turn and I will walk back down. And so, again, this journey had been somewhat hard fought. So that combination of, again, getting to a point where I did what I said I was going to do, and the relief in saying, and now I can be done, and turn and on my heels and go back down the mountain.
So it's almost like the pony ride was your reward for the hard-fought adventure that you went on, because we sometimes think that everything is going to be rainbows and lollipops, but adventure travel can be difficult, and you had a lot of big challenges on this one.
I did. There were lots of moments where I had to say to myself, okay, Tracy, how are you feeling? Are you going to go forward, or do you want to turn back? And there's certainly no shame if you decide that this is enough and it's time to turn around. I could have made that decision a couple of times, and most notably when Chuck turned back as well. But I decided it clear-eyed to go forward. But it was not without an emotional toll. And I think what's really important about this trek and this story is that for those adventure travelers out there, when we travel like this, there is a certain degree of risk. which we assume and which we prepare for in many ways. And sometimes things don't go as we planned. So when I wrote One Woman's Walk in the Himalayas, I wanted to tell this somewhat remarkable story because I thought it was interesting and people had told me you should write this one down as well. But I also wanted to encourage people not to be deterred if things don't turn out like you planned. You certainly need to take your personal safety into account and make sure that you're making good decisions along the way. And sometimes those decisions are made only with the information that you have available to you at that time. And I tried to make good decisions. My background actually is in crisis communications. And so I'm somewhat practiced in looking around the corner and planning for worst case scenarios.
I would agree that you made sharp decisions. And like I said, you don't have all the facts and you have to go with, and sometimes your gut with the knowledge that you do have. And did you ever have any regrets about your choices?
I did not regret this trip at all. Although I will tell you that the subtitle of my book, One Woman's Walk in the Himalayas, is not every idea is a good idea, but you don't know until you try. And the point there is that we really never know. We don't have a crystal ball to know if things will work out, if this adventure will, be great fun and exceed our expectations every step of the way, or if things will happen that were unexpected and despite our careful planning, that will leave us with perhaps the rewards of lessons learned. And those have their own payoff as well. So what I want to do is make sure that we encourage your listeners, and as I coached myself, to keep going and keep exploring, even though this one didn't turn out like I had planned.
And in a lot of cases, in this story in particular, you enjoyed a lot of type 2 fun. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I have millennial kids who taught me the phrase type 2 fun, which I hadn't heard of previously. So type 1 fun is fun at the time and fun as you look back on it. Type 2 fun is not necessarily fun at the time, but when you look back on it, there are funny stories, there are lessons learned, and there are the rewards of now. I laugh that there's type 3 fun as well, which is not fun at the time and you don't want to ever think about it again sort of fun. But I would characterize this trip as very much type 2 fun. It was not a rollicking good time. It was somewhat lonely. I had to reach deep sometimes to sort of continue on and coach myself to take my next step. There were times when I was cold and certainly less than clean. The conditions were poor because in the aftermath of the earthquake, an already fragile infrastructure was strained even further. And I was by myself and didn't have a companion or companions to share my thoughts with. So type 2 fun is certainly not fun at the time, but well worth the reward and the payout in the long run.
And I think it's the type 2 fun that's where you get your growth from. And when we look online, all the social media, everything's so heavily curated, everything's perfect online, and trips don't always go perfectly. But like I said, I feel more growth and more sense of achievement when I tackled the obstacles that got thrown my way whenever I do one of these trips.
And you're absolutely right. That's where you stretch. That's where we learn about ourselves. That's where we put all of our lessons and our personal experience at work. It's not just about knowledge. Now it's about the application of knowledge. And how do we apply what we know? And in some cases, test our mettle and see you come out on the other side with a renewed sense of confidence that you can surmount every obstacle. And when you do face those fears that you have and the worries that you take along with you, you sort of march right on past them. And in that there is great reward as well.
And I think you pull those lessons from these trips and can apply them in your home life, in your work life, because you get confidence. Hey, if I tackled the Annapurna, I can certainly tackle my boss or whatever the case is. And so it's one of the main reasons that I encourage people to get out there and do these kinds of adventures, just so that they can get that growth and that confidence. There's one other thing I wanted to ask you about. All right, when I come back from a trip, particularly the more challenging ones like this, I know I've changed slightly. And you're married, so when you come home slightly different, how is the re-adaptation to the marriage? Or can you talk a little bit about that? Because, or do you agree that you come back a little bit different?
Absolutely. I don't think I come back so different that my husband Rick doesn't know me anymore. And I think that some of those things we sort out are inside and with our own inner conversations. And so I've never had a problem coming back and sort of reacquainting with my husband and my marriage, which has been a blessing every step of the way. Rick is also an adventurer and off the beaten track kind of person. And so he really appreciates these kinds of adventures. And while he did not go on this one, nor on El Camino de Santiago, we have taken many of these adventures together. I know you have walked the West Highland Way, and that's a trek that my husband and I have enjoyed as well.
Definitely. And did you go with him to Saint Michel?
Yes, just recently we took it was a one-day pilgrimage to Mont Saint Michel, which is off of the coast of France. And we walked across the bay toward the abbey at low tide, barefoot, just like the pilgrims did. This is a very interesting pilgrimage, and it's quite moving as you see the abbey get closer and closer. You can't do this walk without a guide because, again, you're walking at low tide, and it can be treacherous. There is some quicksand, and of course, when the tide comes back in, it rushes, and there have been people over the years, and I would say submit over the centuries, who have been caught unaware. So you don't want to do that trek without a guide who will also stop along the way and give you a sense of history, a sense of the ecology of the bay, and certainly the wonderful spiritual sense of walking into Mont Saint Michel.
Very cool. I would love to do that because I've wanted to see it for myself, but I didn't know you could walk across. I think that's super cool. So I'll put links to all this in the show notes as well. And I was wondering, could I ask you to please read an excerpt from your book?
I would love to. Thank you for asking. I may have put myself to a test that I wasn't quite ready for. But here's the thing. If you wait until you think you're ready, you may never act. And if you take enough adventures and try enough new things, you are bound to face a sliding scale of success. Even when you carefully plan and mitigate your risks, some experiences will not be what you expect. As I look back at decades of adventure travel, I realize that the stories I remember are the ones that didn't go as planned. I think about how adversity shapes us and hardens the ground in front of us, preparing us for our next step. There's a certain triumph in misadventure. This story would be like thousands of other treks on the Annapurna Circuit without a series of unfortunate events that constantly changed my plans, combined with poor conditions following a devastating earthquake and my own obsession about the tragedy on the high pass the year before. Life gets messy. Sometimes we're afraid. We want everything to go as planned, and then we get thrown a curveball that we didn't see coming. So you take a swing and remind yourself that it's okay to be afraid. After all, there is no courage without the presence of fear. It's not about the absence of fear. It's about how to manage it.
I love that. The book is called One Woman's Walk in the Himalayas, and our guest today is Tracy Pawelski. And I'm going to have links to all of Tracy's social links where you can buy her One Woman's Walk in the Himalayas, and she wrote a book on her One Woman's Camino. So I'll have all that in the show notes, plus links to our website, etc. So any final thoughts, Tracy, of what you'd like us to take away today?
Just to keep getting out there and traveling. And Kit, thank you for what you do, keeping a community of adventure travelers connected. I love listening to your podcast and appreciate participating today.
Oh, we loved having you on the show, and I'm hoping I'm going to see you with my little Sophie girl when I go on my little jaunt this summer. So hopefully we'll get a chance to get together, maybe get on the Appalachian Trail for a day or two.
You absolutely stop by and see me.
Well, I sure appreciate your time today.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right. I sure hope you enjoyed today's interview as much as I did. I was reminded once again about something when it comes to people who have a fondness for adventure travel, and that is Tracy and I have never met in person, yet we were instantly bonded, instant kindred spirits. Even though we really didn't know that much about us, we had this shared bond. We both loved these long-distance hikes. We loved going on adventure travel, and we loved talking about it. We loved sharing it. And I hope that came through in today's show. I hope we were also able to impart how it's not necessary to try to make every trip perfect. In fact, they're not going to be perfect, particularly when it comes to adventure travel. Things are often going to go wrong, but that's where you grow. That's where you stretch yourself, and that's actually where you get your favorite memories from, even if they aren't necessarily that fun at the time. Make sure that you head to the website today so you see all of Tracy's photos. There'll be links to get her books. She's got the one that we talked about today, A Woman's Walk in the Himalayas. She also did One Woman's Camino, about her adventure with her daughter walking the El Camino 5 years ago. And she's a great writer. I think you'll enjoy the books very much. And I would appreciate if you use my links. It is one way that you can show support of the program. Often my links are affiliate links, which means at no additional cost to you. You're helping to support the program, which helps cover some of the costs of the podcast and the website. So I appreciate that a lot. I'm doing my best to keep this program ad-free and the website ad-free. And this is one way that I can do it. So in the show notes too, you'll find all the links that we talked about today. If you're interested in doing the Annapurna Circuit yourself, be sure that you get the travel planner that you'll get automatically if you are a member of the monthly newsletter. You can always reach out to me at kit@activetravelaadventures.com to get on that newsletter so I can send it to you. I promise I don't spam you, and you can always unsubscribe. If you enjoyed today's show, I would appreciate it if you shared it with your friends, share it on your social media, and get the word out so we can get as many people getting the thrills and the self-fulfillment and self-confidence that comes from adventure travel. I hope you enjoyed today's visit to the Annapurna Circuit in Nepal. I know I did, and I look forward to seeing you next time. I sure appreciate you listening. And until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on.